I think it's very clear. Number one, Pakistan is not a victim of terrorism. It's a victim of its own policies on terrorism. There is unnecessary jubilation in Pakistan that they were mentioned by Donald Trump and they were thanked in that State of the Union address. But I don't think the Americans have any great use for Pakistan. The Taliban, in fact, accused the Pakistanis of being hand in glove with the ISKP because the TTP guys, although ISKP is also formed of a lot of TTP guys, former TTP guys, but the TTP guys are mostly ideological fellow travelers of the Taliban. We must remain alive to the possibility of the Americans once again dumping us, not completely, but in some respects.
US President Donald Trump recently thanked Pakistan for its role in the arrest of Mohammad Sharifullah, a suspect linked to the 2021 Kabul airport bombing. The bombing occurred on August 26th during the chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan. It resulted in the deaths of 13 American service members and hundreds of Afghans. The attack was claimed by ISIS Khorasan. To give us some perspective on the story, strategic affairs expert Sushant Sareen is joining me from New Delhi. Mr. Sareen, thank you so much for joining us. The Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif tweeted moments after the US President thanked Pakistan for the act, and I just quickly want to quote from his tweet. We thank US President Donald Trump for acknowledging and appreciating Pakistan's role and support in counter-terrorism efforts across the region. As is well known, Pakistan has always played a critical role in counter-terrorism efforts aimed at denying safe havens to terrorists and militant groups. Is it really well known?
It sounds more like some kind of a political satire, a geopolitical satire for the Pakistanis to claim that they are playing this role in the war on terrorism. Look, I think it's very clear. Number one, Pakistan is not a victim of terrorism. It's a victim of its own policies on terrorism. And what it's facing is a blowback of its own policies. That's point number one. Point number two, uh, for the Pakistanis to say that, look, we are very thankful to the US president for acknowledging our contribution in this war on terror. This is like, and I was reading somewhere, a Mexican drug cartel thanking President Trump because they have given some low life or low level functionary to the Americans, extradited him or handed him over to the Americans, and the Americans, for their own political reasons, are celebrating it. And the Mexican drug cartel says that, look, uh, we are contributing in this war against drugs. So Pakistan handing over this character to the Americans is somewhat similar. But having said that, I think there is unnecessary jubilation in Pakistan that they were mentioned by Donald Trump and they were thanked in that State of the Union address, and they are even more jubilant because in that same State of the Union address, Donald Trump took a couple of pot shots at India. Nothing new; he's been doing it for very long on the issue of tariffs. So they think that there's a certain negative vibe about India and there's a positive vibe about Pakistan. But having said that, there are a couple of things out here. One, uh, at one level, I think the American Pakistani cooperation, which was, again, this is not rocket science, a lot of people were already expecting it. The Americans are not going to break off their relationship with Pakistan. I think we would be foolish to be expecting something like that. But I don't think the Americans have any great use for Pakistan. So uh, it was already being anticipated that the Americans will be dealing with Pakistan in the counterterrorism domain. And there will be some amount of cooperation, maybe intelligence sharing, perhaps joint operations, something else on intelligence, on counterterrorism, and of course focused on the entire AFPAC region. So there has been that expectation, and perhaps uh, whatever has happened behind the scenes, nobody knows the full story. But it does seem that that particular element has come into play. So at one level, it's a very transactional kind of a relationship and very limited to the city domain. At another level, I think the fact, and I think the Pakistanis have played smart on this. They've handed over this guy who was by all accounts, now it turns out, a low level functionary. He was not exactly the mastermind or this evil genius who was planning all these plots. And apparently, according to some reports, he was already in Pakistani custody, and he was then handed over to the Americans. And the Pakistanis were keeping, and they have an entire bank of such characters, which they produce at an opportune time to monetize these characters. So he is one of those. Now, one would expect that the Americans have seen through this game, that they have dealt with the Pakistanis for 20 years while the US was in Afghanistan, and the Pakistanis were playing these double games with the Americans. Every time there was a big meeting or there was a big event, the Pakistanis would hand over one or two characters to the Americans, or make a show that we have attacked a certain place and got hold of some Al Qaeda fellow and we've handed him over to the Americans. And once that was over, behind the scenes, the Pakistanis would continue doing what they were doing, basically running with the hare and hunting with the hound. Now, one would have thought that the Americans, especially people in this new administration, people like Tulsi Gabbard, people like Pete Hegseth, even the NSA, Mike Waltz, people who have served in Afghanistan, who have been part and parcel of the entire war on terrorism effort, would be wise to what was happening. But clearly not. It seems that Donald Trump is, wanted to gloat in the State of the Union address about uh, ramping up efforts against the Islamist terrorists, and he's got this thing which he can gloat about in front of the U.S. public. Now, if that is the direction in which things are going to go, then clearly, there is a limited amount of utility of these kind of actions which will come about. So I don't see a major transformation taking place in the US-Pakistan relationship. I would imagine that the Pakistanis will continue to play that very slimy game which they are past masters in. With the Americans, I don't know whether the Americans will also indulge them uh, sometime to get what they want out of them. But there is also a possibility that going forward, if things or if the Americans decide that they need to have some kind of a regime change in Afghanistan, then I think all bets are off. Then I'm not saying the Americans are going to put boots on the ground, but then you could see a certain greater involvement of the Americans with the Pakistanis in terms of beefing up Pakistani capabilities to take the necessary action to destabilize the Taliban regime in
Right.
Afghanistan and install their own puppet regime out there. Now, again, uh, that will be a quagmire uh, which I don't think the Pakistanis will be able to handle. But for the Pakistanis, they will think about it when they get into the quagmire. Right now, I think all that they're looking at is the prospect of dollars streaming into Pakistan and pulling
Right.
them out of the rut in which they are.
I was just going to come to that. How are you putting this transfer in perspective of strained relations between Pakistan and the Taliban, especially over the TTP?
Look, this particular guy who was handed over is not a TTP guy. He is
Hmm.
be an ISKP fellow.
But the
On the
fact that the Pakistani Prime Minister categorically said that he's an Afghan national and we caught him at the Afghan Pakistan border, what does it tell you about Pakistan and Taliban's relations?
No, so one second. Look, the Taliban have an adversarial relationship with the ISKP, right? That's a no-brainer. The Taliban, in fact, accused the Pakistanis of being hand in glove with the ISKP. Now, it's not that the ISKP has not carried out terror attacks inside Pakistan, but this is a very murky world. So, uh, you could have some kind of tactical understanding between the Pakistanis and the ISKP. Pakistan could be giving some space to ISKP, and also asking them to do certain things for Pakistan, and at the same time cracking down on in other areas. They've done this in the past. They could be doing it with ISKP again, and pretending to the rest of the world that they are actually as opposed to ISKP as the Taliban are. Now, that is one part of it. The TTP element is a completely different element. The TTP is more aligned to the Afghan Taliban, right? It's the same ideological grouping. Now, very often the Afghan Taliban tell the Pakistanis that look, we don't expect us to go after the TTP, because if we were to do that, there is a good chance that the TTP will make common cause with ISKP. I personally believe that that's a bit of a hogwash, because the TTP guys, although ISKP is also formed of a lot of TTP guys, former TTP guys, but the TTP guys are mostly ideological fellow travelers of the Taliban. For them to shift or to make an alliance with the ISK is not going to be that easy for ideological and doctrinal reasons. I suspect that the Taliban will keep the TTP alive, partly because they are fraternal cousins, partly
Hmm.
because the TTP gives them leverage over Pakistan, and not because the TTP will go and make common cause with ISKP. So when Shahbaz Sharif, I don't even think Shahbaz Sharif knew that this guy had been arrested and I was being handed over to to the Americans. Shahbaz Sharif is a non-entity. Like I often say, his rank might be prime minister, but his status is that of a personal secretary to the army chief. That's his status, right? So I don't think the army chief would have even told Shahbaz Sharif that he's handing over this guy to the Americans. He would have been informed later on. So for Shahbaz Sharif to pretend as though he knew where exactly on the AFPAC border this guy was arrested is utter nonsense. I don't buy it. Not for a minute will I buy it. Uh, but he had to make a statement because that's his job. You know, he's the facade of this military regime in Pakistan. So as the facade of that military regime, he's made the statement. Nothing more, nothing less. On the other dynamic of the ISKP and the Taliban, again, the ISKP is probably the only significant challenge to the Taliban in Afghanistan right now, if at all there is any challenge. The other challenge is, of course, Pakistan. And the Taliban suspect that the Pakistanis have actually uh, g- been giving space in terms of training camps, in terms of meeting grounds to the ISKP in Balochistan and perhaps even parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, because the ISKP will then target the Taliban, and that will give the Pakistanis leverage over the Taliban. So it's that kind of a murky game going on between the Taliban and the Pakistanis.
Right. Also, since you say that the only sector Washington would even want to engage with Islamabad is counter-terrorism, even then, the fact that there is a relationship and the relationship could build for XYZ reasons in the future, do you think New Delhi should be wary of this at all?
Look, I think in principle and in general, we should always be wary of all international relations. I think even the Europeans are now realizing that you don't put all your eggs in one basket, certainly not Donald Trump's basket, right? Um,
Hmm.
so I personally think that countries need to, keep a few aces up their sleeve, even when they are in a very close relationship with any other country, because you don't know how tomorrow the other countries calculations will change, and then things slip out of control. So I personally think that we must remain alive to the possibility of the Americans once again dumping us, not completely but in some respects, to suck up to the Pakistanis so that they can get what they want, because it serves the American interest. And with Donald Trump, it's very clear that if it serves American interest, he's not going to bat an eyelid to throw India under the bus, right? So we need to be clear on that count. We should not act later on as though, oh God, what the hell has happened? We were not even we did never thought something like this would happen. I don't think we can afford the luxury of feigning ignorance, of feigning innocence, that something like this might happen in the future. So let's keep a few aces up our sleeve. Let's keep our other options open, even though we engage and we develop a partnership with the Americans. That, of course, we need to do right now, but keeping our other options open. That is one part of it. The second part of it is, even if the Pakistanis and the Americans were to get closer, it would
Hmm.
only be around a very, very limited objective, at least as things stand right now. It would be around a very limited objective of counterterrorism. I don't see the Americans looking at Pakistan as a pivotal place for strategic engagement, which has a kind of a geopolitical implication. I don't see that happen. I don't see the Americans depending on Pakistanis to break off with the Chinese, and side with the Americans. I don't think that's on the anvil. I don't see how they look at Pakistan as this new, great, growing economy which will serve American purpose. That's not part of Donald Trump's calculation. And I don't think Pakistan has the wherewithal to fit that particular role, even if it was part of Donald Trump's calculation. So, like I said, it is a very limited Afghanistan centric, counterterrorism centric role that might be there for Pakistan. And if it brings a couple of $1 billion to the Pakistanis, I think the generals will be happy that, at least another generation of generals and their children can go and buy expensive apartments and ranches in Australia, apartments in New York, flats in London. And all these white folk and Western folk will then tell us about, corruption, on democratic backsliding. I never heard them talk about all of that in the context of Pakistan. Pakistan, at least nominally, has a civilian government. But do you think any American even bothers talking to the civilians in Pakistan? No, they don't. They know these guys have nothing in store. So they go and talk to the guys in uniform. And the Americans seem to love the men on horseback. That's what they want to do business with. That's what they'll do business with. So to that extent, the relationship will stay. But I don't see anything much coming out of it.
All right, Mr. Serene, thank you so much for that.
Thanks.